rejected beneath the summer sun. They said no woman that size could survive a frontier summer. But when Evelyn Moore walked into flames to save a rancher's livestock, the whole town learned what real strength looked like. This is the story of a mail-order bride rejected by everyone except the one man who understood that worth isn't measured by appearance, but by the courage to stay when everyone else walks away. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Evelyn's story travels. And if her journey moves you, hit that like button and stay until the end. You won't regret it. The summer sun beat down on Copper Ridge like a punishment from an angry sky, turning the dusty main street into a shimmering ribbon of heat that made the air itself seem to ripple and breathe. Evelyn Moore stood at the edge of the community hall's wooden platform, her fingers twisted into the fabric of her only good dress, a faded blue cotton that had seen better days and now clung uncomfortably to her generous frame in the oppressive heat. Sweat traced delicate paths down her temples despite the handkerchief she'd used that morning, and she could feel every eye in the crowded room measuring, judging, finding her wanting. The mail-order bride selection was supposed to be her fresh start. The advertisements had promised opportunity, new beginnings, a chance for women of good character and sound constitution to find husbands on the Montana frontier. They hadn't mentioned the humiliation of standing before dozens of men while they evaluated you like livestock at auction, their gazes sliding over you with barely concealed disappointment before moving on to someone smaller, prettier, more acceptable. "Next," called out Reverend Michaels, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of a man who'd overseen too many of these proceedings. He gestured toward Evelyn with a slight inclination of his head, his expression carefully blank. Evelyn stepped forward, her shoes, scuffed brown leather that pinched her toes, making soft sounds against the worn floorboards. The hall had been decorated with wildflowers in an attempt at cheerfulness, their purple and yellow blooms already wilting in the heat. Long tables lined the walls, covered with white cloths that someone had starched with care, bearing pitchers of lukewarm water and glasses that caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows. She'd practiced her introduction during the long train journey from Philadelphia. She'd memorized the words, rehearsed the smile, imagined a dozen different scenarios. None of them had prepared her for this. "My name is Evelyn Moore," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm 26 years old from Philadelphia. I worked as a seamstress for the Hartwell family for 8 years. I can cook, clean, sew, tend gardens, and manage household accounts. I'm healthy and strong, and I'm looking for an honest man who needs a hard-working wife." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush her. She watched the men's faces, reading the story written in their expressions. The young cowboy near the front shifted uncomfortably and looked away. The shopkeeper with kind eyes offered an apologetic smile but made no move forward. The three brothers who'd been whispering amongst themselves fell silent, their interest clearly elsewhere. "Can you ride?" asked a gruff voice from the middle of the crowd. A burly man with a salt and pepper beard, probably in his 40s, arms crossed over his barrel chest. "I can learn," Evelyn replied, meeting his eyes directly. "I'm a quick study. Can you shoot?" This from a younger man, barely 20, with sun-bleached hair and nervous hands. "No, but I imagine that's also something I could learn, if needed." "What about children?" The question came from an older gentleman near the window, his weathered face creased with what might have been genuine curiosity. "You got experience with young ones?" "I helped raise my 3 younger siblings after my mother passed," Evelyn said, grateful for a question she could answer with confidence. "The youngest was only 4 at the time. I know how to care for children." More silence. She watched hope drain away like water through a sieve, each moment of quiet, another confirmation of what she'd feared since arriving. The other women who'd come on the train, slender, young, pretty, Sarah with her honey-colored hair and dimpled smile, quiet Martha with her porcelain complexion and delicate features, they'd already been claimed. Sarah by a prosperous-looking rancher who couldn't stop smiling at her, Martha by a gentle-seeming farmer who'd approached her with his hat in his hands and actual poetry memorized. Evelyn hadn't expected poetry, but she'd expected someone. "Thank you, Miss Moore," Reverend Michaels said, his tone gentle but final. "You can step down now. Gentlemen, are there any—" "She's too big." The words came from somewhere in the crowd, spoken just loud enough to carry. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter followed, quickly stifled, but unmistakable. Evelyn's face burned hotter than the summer air. She'd heard variations of those words her entire life, from her father's disappointed sighs to the Hartwell daughter's cruel whispers, from the boys who'd mocked her in school to the Philadelphia men who'd looked through her as if she didn't exist. She'd thought distance might change things. She'd hoped the frontier, where survival mattered more than society's narrow standards of beauty, might be different. She'd been wrong. "That'll be enough of that," Reverend Michaels said sharply, his neutrality finally cracking. "Every woman here deserves respect." But respect wasn't the same as wanted. Respect didn't put a roof over your head or food on your table. Respect didn't change the fact that Evelyn could feel her chances slipping away with each passing second, with each man who found somewhere else to look. She descended the platform steps carefully, fighting to keep her chin up and her expression composed. The blue dress felt like a flag of failure, too tight across her shoulders, too short in the hem where she'd let it out as much as the fabric would allow. Her carpet bag waited near the door, packed with everything she owned in the world. 3 additional dresses, undergarments, her mother's Bible, a packet of letters from her siblings, her sewing kit, and the advertisement that had brought her here with its promises of new beginnings. The hall's side door stood open, offering a view of the street beyond and the distant mountains rising purple against the bright sky. Freedom, perhaps, or just another kind of emptiness. "Miss Moore?" The voice came from the back of the hall, quiet but clear, deep, tired sounding, like a man who'd forgotten how to hope for much of anything but was trying anyway. Evelyn turned. The other women still waiting on the platform turned too, along with half the crowd. The man who'd spoken stood in the shadows near the far wall, his broad-brimmed hat pulled low enough that she couldn't quite make out his features. He was tall, she could tell that much even from across the room, with shoulders that spoke of years of hard labor and a stillness about him that suggested either patience or resignation. His clothes were clean but worn, brown trousers, a faded blue shirt, scuffed boots that had seen considerable use. "Yes?" Evelyn managed, her heart suddenly beating faster. He stepped forward into the light, and she got her first clear look at him. Maybe 35 or 40, with sun-weathered skin and lines around his eyes that came from squinting into bright horizons. His jaw was strong beneath a few days' worth of dark stubble, his hair the color of coffee, and equally dark eyes that studied her with an intensity that made her breath catch. But it was the sadness in those eyes that struck her most, a bone-deep weariness that transcended the physical exhaustion of frontier life. "I'm Jonah Hale," he said, his voice carrying easily across the now silent hall. "I have a ranch about 8 miles north of here, been running it 3 years now." He paused, his gaze never leaving her face. Evelyn felt exposed under that scrutiny, but also, strangely, seen. Not judged, exactly. Just observed with a thoroughness that suggested he was actually looking at her as a person rather than an object to be evaluated and discarded. "I need a wife," Jonah continued bluntly. "Someone strong enough for hard work. Someone who won't run off when things get difficult, because they will get difficult. Someone who can help with my 4 children and won't expect romance or pretty words, because I don't have those to give." The hall erupted in whispers. 4 children. That explained the shadows under his eyes, the exhaustion in his posture. 4 children? Evelyn repeated, finding her voice. "Yes, ma'am, ages 3 to 11. They need a mother. I need help. The ranch needs more hands than I've got." He shifted his weight, his hat now in his hands, turning it slowly. "I can offer you a home, food, safety, protection of my name, fair treatment, but I won't lie and say it'll be easy." It wasn't poetry, it wasn't even particularly kind, but it was honest, and Evelyn had learned to value honesty above almost everything else. "What happened to their mother?" she asked, the question probably too direct but needing to be spoken anyway. Something flickered across Jonah's face, pain, quick and sharp, then carefully locked away again. "She died 18 months ago. Fever took her in 3 days." The whispers grew louder. Evelyn caught fragments. "Still grieving. Too soon. Those poor children." She looked at this weathered, sad-eyed rancher who stood alone while every other man in the hall had found reasons to reject her. She thought about her dwindling options, about the money she didn't have for a train ticket back to Philadelphia, about her brother's cramped apartment where she'd been sleeping on the floor before deciding to answer the mail-order bride advertisement. She thought about the cruel laughter following that comment about her size, and the quiet dignity in Jonah Hale's voice when he'd spoken her name. "I can work hard," Evelyn said clearly, projecting her voice so everyone could hear. "I won't run off. And I know how to care for children." "Then come with me," Jonah replied. No hesitation, no pretty speeches. "We'll speak to Reverend Michaels about the arrangements." And just like that, Evelyn Moore's life changed direction. Not with romance or passion or any of the things the dime novels had promised, just with a tired man's practical offer and her own desperate hope that being needed might be enough. The wagon ride to the Hale Ranch took over an hour, following a rutted dirt road that wound through grassland turned golden by the relentless summer heat. Evelyn sat on the hard wooden bench beside Jonah, her carpet bag at her feet, watching the landscape roll past with a mixture of apprehension and determination. Neither of them spoke much. The silence wasn't entirely comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either, just the quiet of two strangers who'd made a practical arrangement and were now figuring out what that meant. The sun blazed overhead, making the air shimmer and dance. Grasshoppers rose in clouds from the dry vegetation, their wings catching the light. In the distance, mountains created a jagged line against the endless blue sky, their peaks still holding patches of white that promised cooler temperatures somewhere far above. Jonah drove with easy competence, his hands steady on the reins, his attention on the road and the two horses pulling the wagon. They were sturdy animals, brown and patient-looking, their tails swishing at flies. Everything about the man beside her spoke of endurance, not flash or show, but the kind of quiet strength that came from surviving things that would break lesser people. "The children," Evelyn finally ventured as they crested a small rise. "What are their names?" Jonah was quiet for a moment, and she wondered if he'd answer. Then, "Emma's the oldest. She's 11. Smart as a whip and tries to be her mother." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Samuel's 9. Good boy but angry. Hasn't quite forgiven the world yet for taking his ma." Evelyn nodded, saying nothing, letting him continue in his own time. "Lucy's 6. She still wets the bed sometimes. Nightmares." He cleared his throat. "And Thomas is 3. He barely remembers his mother, which is maybe a mercy, and maybe the saddest thing of all." "They must miss her terribly," Evelyn said softly. "Yes." Just that one word, but weighted with 18 months of grief and exhaustion and trying to be both parents to 4 children while keeping a ranch running. "I'll do my best by them," Evelyn offered. "I can't replace their mother, but I can care for them. I will care for them." Jonah glanced at her then, really looked at her for the first time since they'd left town. His dark eyes were unreadable, but something in his expression softened fractionally. "That's all I'm asking. Don't try to be something you're not. Just be steady. Be there. That's what they need." "What about what you need?" Evelyn thought, but didn't ask. The answer was written clearly enough in the lines around his eyes, in the careful way he held himself separate, in the matter-of-fact tone he used when discussing his dead wife. Jonah Hale needed help, not comfort. Labor, not love. And that was fine. Evelyn could do labor. She'd been doing it her whole life. The ranch came into view as they rounded another bend, a collection of weathered wooden buildings scattered across a shallow valley where a creek cut a green line through the golden grass. The main house was larger than Evelyn had expected, 2 stories with a wide porch across the front and a stone chimney rising from one end. The paint had faded to a soft gray, and several shutters hung slightly crooked, but the structure looked solid. Beyond it stood a barn, a chicken coop, a smokehouse, and several other outbuildings she couldn't immediately identify. Cattle dotted the distant hillsides, dark shapes against the pale grass. Closer to the house, a vegetable garden showed signs of struggling in the heat, wilted leaves, cracked earth despite evidence of recent watering. "It's not much," Jonah said, pulling the wagon to a stop near the house. "But it's paid for, and it's ours." Ours. The word settled over Evelyn like an unfamiliar garment, neither comfortable nor entirely unwelcome. Before she could respond, the front door banged open and 4 children spilled onto the porch like water released from a dam. They arranged themselves in descending order of height, a stair-step of young faces ranging from wary to openly hostile. Emma, the 11-year-old, had her mother's features, or so Evelyn assumed from the delicate bone structure and wide eyes. She wore a faded calico dress and an expression of fierce protectiveness, one hand resting on her youngest brother's shoulder. Her hair, the color of wheat, had been braided with care but was coming loose in wispy tendrils around her face. Samuel stood beside her, all sharp angles and defensive posture. 9 years old and already carrying himself like a man who'd been betrayed once and wouldn't allow it again. His clothes were too small, trousers ending above his ankles, shirt sleeves creeping up his wrists, and his dark eyes tracked Evelyn's every movement with obvious suspicion. Lucy, 6 and small for her age, half hid behind Emma's skirt, peering out with a thumb in her mouth despite being too old for such comfort. Her dress was clean but patched in multiple places, and her blonde hair hung in tangled ringlets that suggested Emma's braiding skills hadn't yet extended to the younger children. Thomas, the 3-year-old, clung to Emma's other side, his chubby face smudged with what looked like jam or dirt, or both. He wore short pants and a shirt that had probably once been white, his feet bare despite the rough wooden planks of the porch. 4 pairs of eyes measuring her, finding her wanting probably, just like the men in town. But these were children, and Evelyn had never yet met a child she couldn't at least try to understand. "Children," Jonah said, climbing down from the wagon and moving around to offer Evelyn his hand. "This is Miss Moore. We were married this afternoon by Reverend Michaels." He paused. The lie, or not quite lie, more like an oversimplification of the proxy ceremony they'd agreed to, settling into the hot air between them. "She's going to be living here now, helping with the house and the cooking and looking after you." Evelyn accepted his hand, surprised by the calluses against her palm, the careful strength in his grip as he helped her down. She stood on solid ground, smoothing her dress, trying to find the right words. "Hello?" she finally said, keeping her voice gentle but not syrupy. Children could smell false sweetness a mile away. "I know this is strange for you. New people always are. But I promise I'll work hard and do my best." "We don't need you," Samuel said flatly. "Emma takes care of us just fine." "Samuel," Jonah's voice carried a warning, "it's true. We don't need some stranger coming in and pretending to be our ma. We already had a ma, and she was perfect, and nobody can replace her, so you might as well just leave now." The boy's voice cracked on the last words, betraying the tears he was fighting. Emma's hand tightened on his shoulder, her young face showing a maturity no 11-year-old should have to carry. Evelyn met Samuel's angry gaze steadily. "You're absolutely right," she said quietly. "I can't replace your mother. I won't even try. She was yours, and she always will be. I'm just here to help, if you'll let me." The answer seemed to deflate some of Samuel's rage. He blinked rapidly, looking away, his jaw clenched tight. "Can you make biscuits?" Lucy asked suddenly, her voice small around her thumb. "Yes," Evelyn said. "I can make biscuits." "Mama made good biscuits," Thomas offered, his childish voice matter-of-fact. "With butter." "Then I'll do my best to make good biscuits, too," Evelyn promised, crouching down despite the protest of her knees so she was closer to the little boy's level. "Maybe you can help me sometime. I bet you're a good helper." Thomas considered this gravely, then nodded. "I'm very good. Emma says so." "I just bet you are." Jonah cleared his throat. "Emma, can you show Miss Moore to the spare room upstairs? Help her get settled. Samuel, there's still water to fetch for the evening. Lucy, Thomas, you two start gathering eggs. We'll need plenty for breakfast." The children scattered to their tasks with the automatic obedience of those who'd learned that work didn't wait for feelings. Only Emma remained, studying Evelyn with ancient eyes and a young face. "This way," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral. Evelyn followed the girl into the house, Jonah bringing her carpet bag behind them. The interior was dim after the bright sunshine, and it took a moment for Evelyn's eyes to adjust. When they did, she found herself in a large front room that served multiple purposes: sitting area, dining area, and kitchen space all flowing together. The furniture was handmade but sturdy. A table with 8 mismatched chairs, a rocking chair near the stone fireplace, a few rough shelves holding dishes and supplies. Everything was clean, she noticed. Not perfectly organized, and showing signs of hard use, but genuinely clean. Emma's work, obviously. The girl had been trying to hold her family together through sheer will and elbow grease. The stairs creaked under their feet as Emma led the way up to the second floor. A narrow hallway connected 4 rooms, 3 with doors open, 1 closed. "That's Papa's room," Emma said, gesturing to the closed door at the end. "He doesn't like people going in there." Her emphasis suggested this was a rule carved in stone, enforced absolutely. "Understood," Evelyn said. "Samuel and Thomas share this room. Lucy and I share that one." Emma pointed to the 2 open doors on the right, both revealing small spaces with simple beds and few possessions. Then she opened the remaining door, revealing a tiny room barely large enough for the narrow bed, small dresser, and single chair it contained. "This was the sewing room," Emma explained, her voice carefully flat. "Before Mama died, she used to make our clothes here. Now it's just empty." The window overlooked the back of the property, offering a view of the barn and the creek beyond, the mountains rising in the distance. Sunlight streamed through slightly dusty glass, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. The bed had been made up with obvious care, clean sheets, a faded quilt that showed skilled handiwork in its tiny, even stitches. "It's perfect," Evelyn said honestly. "Thank you for getting it ready." Emma shrugged, but something in her expression eased fractionally. "Papa said to. I just followed orders." Jonah set the carpetbag on the chair, looking around the small space with an unreadable expression. "It's not much," he said, echoing his words about the ranch itself. "It's mine," Evelyn replied, and meant it. This small room, this narrow bed, this single window, they represented more security than she'd had in years. That makes it more than enough. Something passed between them then, a moment of understanding that transcended the practical arrangement they'd made. They were both survivors, both people who'd learned to value the tangible over the romantic, the real over the ideal. "Dinner's usually at 6, Jonah said, breaking the moment. "Emma's been managing it, but I expect that'll be your responsibility now. There's salt pork in the cold room, potatoes in the cellar, eggs from this morning. Make what you can." "I'll handle it," Evelyn assured him. He nodded once, then left, his boots heavy on the stairs. Emma lingered in the doorway, watching Evelyn with those 2 old eyes. "You're really staying?" the girl asked quietly. "I'm really staying." "The people leave," Emma said, not quite accusing but not quite neutral either. "Mama left. Mrs. Henderson from town used to come help, but she stopped. Sarah Miller said she'd bring by preserves, but she never did. Everyone says they'll help, but then they don't." Evelyn set her carpetbag on the bed and turned to face the girl fully. "I made a promise to your father," she said, "and I don't break my promises. I'm staying, Emma. Whether you want me here or not, whether it's easy or hard, whether you ever like me or you hate me forever, I'm staying. That's just how it is." Emma studied her for a long moment, clearly trying to decide if this stranger could be trusted. Finally, she said, "The potatoes are in the cellar. You get to it through the door off the kitchen. Watch the 3rd step. It's loose." Then she was gone, her footsteps quick on the stairs, leaving Evelyn alone in the small room that smelled faintly of lavender and abandonment. Evelyn moved to the window, pressing her palm against the sun-warmed glass, and looked out at her new world. The summer landscape stretched endlessly, golden and harsh and beautiful in its own unforgiving way. Somewhere out there, cattle grazed. Somewhere behind her, 4 grieving children were trying to navigate a world that had betrayed them. And somewhere in this house, a man was carrying a weight that would crush most people. She thought about the men who'd rejected her in town, about the laughter that had followed the comment about her size, about all the ways the world had told her she wasn't enough. Then she thought about the work waiting downstairs, about the dinner she needed to prepare, about the chance, however small, to prove that worth wasn't measured in pounds or pretty faces. Evelyn Moore had been unwanted her entire life, but standing in this small room, in this weathered house, on this struggling ranch, she felt the first stirrings of something she'd almost given up on. Purpose. She had work to do. Wow, The kitchen was hotter than the seventh circle of hell, the wood stove radiating heat that made the already oppressive summer air almost unbearable. Evelyn tied her hair back with a strip of cloth she found hanging on a nail, rolled up her sleeves despite propriety, and assessed her resources. The cellar, accessed through a heavy wooden door that required real muscle to open, was blessedly cool and better stocked than she'd expected. Shelves lined the earthen walls, holding jars of preserved vegetables, beans, tomatoes, pickles, along with sacks of potatoes, onions, dried apples. Someone had put up these stores, and recently too, judging by the dates marked on the jar lids in careful handwriting. Emma's work again, probably. The girl had been holding this family together with nothing but determination and learned skills that no child should have to master so young. Evelyn selected potatoes, onions, carrots, found a jar of preserved tomatoes. Back in the kitchen, she discovered flour, salt, lard in the pie safe. The salt pork Jonah had mentioned hung in the cold room attached to the back of the house, along with a few chickens that would likely end up in the pot soon if the ranch's fortunes didn't improve. She worked methodically, falling into the familiar rhythm of food preparation that had carried her through so many years of service. Peel, chop, measure, mix. Her hands knew these tasks the way Jonah's hands knew reins and rope. Through repetition and necessity and the kind of muscle memory that required no conscious thought. Outside, she could hear the children's voices. Samuel's surly responses to whatever his father was asking him to do, Lucy's higher-pitched chatter, Thomas's occasional delighted squeal. The sounds of family, even a broken one, carried a certain music. The back door opened and closed. Emma appeared, carrying a basket of eggs so fresh they still had feathers clinging to them. 14, the girl announced, setting the basket on the table. That's good. Yesterday we only got 9. Chickens appreciate consistency, Evelyn said, peeling another potato. Were you the one who preserved all those vegetables in the cellar? Emma nodded, moving to the basin to wash her hands. Mama showed me how before she got sick. She said a good woman knows how to put by for winter. She was right, Evelyn agreed. You did excellent work. Those jars look professional. A faint flush of pride colored Emma's cheeks, quickly suppressed. It's just what needed doing. Still, it's impressive. They worked in silence for a while, Emma automatically setting the table. 8 places, Evelyn noticed, even though there were only 6 of them now. The girl caught her looking and quickly removed 2 plates, 2 sets of utensils, her movements sharp with something that might have been grief or anger or both. Mama always insisted we set a proper table, Emma said, her voice tight, even when it was just family. She said civilization didn't stop just because we lived on a ranch. She sounds like she was a wise woman, Evelyn ventured carefully. She was perfect, Emma said flatly, an edge of challenge in her tone. Everyone said so. She was beautiful and kind, and she never complained, not even when things were hard. And Papa loved her more than anything in the world. The unspoken words hung in the air like smoke, and you could never measure up to that. Evelyn kept her hands busy, chopping carrots into neat rounds. I imagine she'd be very proud of how you've been taking care of your family, she said quietly. That's not easy work, what you've been doing. Running a household, looking after your brothers and sister, trying to fill a gap that can't really be filled. That takes strength. Emma's hand stilled on the forks she'd been arranging. For a moment, her carefully maintained composure wavered, and Evelyn glimpsed the exhausted child beneath the capable exterior. I don't know if I'm doing it right, Emma whispered. I try, but Thomas still cries at night, and Samuel's so angry all the time, and Lucy keeps having accidents, and Papa just works and never talks about Mama at all, and I don't know if I'm making things better or worse. Evelyn set down her knife and moved to the girl's side, careful not to touch, but standing close enough to offer comfort through proximity. You're doing better than anyone could ask, she said firmly. You're 11 years old, Emma. You shouldn't have to carry all this alone. But there's no one else, Emma said, and a single tear tracked down her cheek before she viciously wiped it away. Papa needs me to be strong. The little ones need me. I can't fall apart. You can with me, Evelyn offered quietly. Not all the time, maybe, but sometimes. When it gets too heavy. I'm here now and I'm staying, and that means you don't have to do everything anymore. Emma looked at her then, really looked. Her young face twisted with the effort of holding back tears. You promise? You really promise you won't leave like everyone else? I promise, Evelyn said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Cross my heart. The girl nodded once, twice, then retreated back to her table setting with renewed energy, as if the brief moment of vulnerability had never happened. But something had shifted between them, some invisible thread of connection that hadn't existed before. Dinner came together, a thick stew with salt pork, potatoes, carrots, and onions, flavored with the preserved tomatoes and herbs Evelyn found growing wild near the back door. Biscuits, not as perfect as she would have liked, the oven temperature being guesswork at best, but decent enough. Butter from the cold room. Apple preserves. When Jonah called the family to dinner, they came with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Thomas climbed into his chair with help from Emma, his small face lighting up at the sight of food. Lucy approached cautiously, still sucking her thumb. Samuel slouched into his seat with obvious reluctance. Jonah took his place at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. "Smells good," he offered, which seemed to be high praise coming from him. They ate in relative silence, broken only by the sounds of utensils on plates, and Thomas's occasional commentary. "This is good. I like carrots. Can I have more?" Evelyn watched them covertly, learning their patterns. Emma ate quickly and efficiently, already thinking ahead to the cleanup. Samuel picked at his food, eating enough to sustain himself, but clearly on principle refusing to enjoy it. Lucy ate with her free hand, the other twisted in her skirt, her eyes darting between Evelyn and her father as if expecting something terrible to happen. And Jonah ate like a man who viewed food as fuel rather than pleasure, methodical and thorough, his attention divided between his plate and his children. "Miss Moore," he said eventually, and the whole table seemed to tense. "This is good cooking." "Thank you," Evelyn replied. "Better than what we've been managing." He met her eyes across the table. "I appreciate it." Such simple words, but they felt like a contract being honored, an agreement being kept. He'd promised her a home and fair treatment. She'd promised hard work and steadiness. Both were delivering on their end. After dinner, Emma automatically began clearing plates, but Evelyn stopped her with a gentle hand. "I'll handle the washing up," she said. "You've been doing it for months. Take a break." "But that's my job," Emma protested. "Not anymore," Evelyn said firmly but kindly. "Or at least not all by yourself anymore. Go play with your sister, read a book, be 11 for a while." Emma looked torn between relief and anxiety, as if she'd forgotten how to be a child and wasn't sure she could remember. Finally, she nodded and disappeared up the stairs, Lucy trailing behind her. Evelyn heated water on the stove, scraping plates and washing dishes while the summer evening slowly deepened beyond the windows. The light turned golden, then amber, then violet as the sun sank toward the mountains. She could hear Jonah outside with the boys, checking on livestock, securing the barn for the night, doing the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch running. By the time she finished and wiped down the table, full darkness had fallen. She found Jonah on the front porch, sitting in an old chair with one of the boys, Thomas, she thought, asleep in his lap. "He fought it," Jonah said quietly, not looking up. "Insisted he was too big for lullabies and bedtime stories. Made it about 10 minutes before he was out cold." Evelyn smiled. 3-year-olds are like that, all fierce independence until they remember they're still babies. "You handled Emma well today," Jonah observed, shifting Thomas slightly to a more comfortable position. "She doesn't trust easy anymore, but she listened to you." "She's a remarkable girl," Evelyn said honestly. "You should be proud of her." "I am." He was quiet for a moment, his hand resting protectively on his sleeping son's back. "But I hate that she's had to grow up so fast. That they've all had to." "Loss does that," Evelyn said softly, thinking of her own siblings, her own stolen childhood. "Steals time that should have been spent differently." They sat in companionable silence, listening to the night sounds, crickets, the distant lowing of cattle, a coyote somewhere far off calling to its pack. The sky overhead blazed with more stars than Evelyn had ever seen in Philadelphia, brilliant points of light scattered across darkness like diamonds on velvet. "I should get him to bed," Jonah finally said, standing carefully to avoid waking Thomas. "Early morning tomorrow. Always is." "What time should I have breakfast ready?" Evelyn asked. 5:30. We start work at first light. He paused, Thomas's small body cradled against his chest. Thank you, Miss Moore. For today. For staying. For trying. Evelyn, she said quietly, if we're going to be living in the same house, you might as well use my first name. Evelyn, he repeated, testing the shape of it. Jonah, then. Seems only fair. He disappeared inside, leaving her alone with the stars and the vast darkness of the frontier night. Evelyn wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the day's exhaustion settle into her bones. It had been one of the strangest days of her life. Rejected publicly, married to a stranger, transported to a new home, thrust into a family held together by threads and determination. And somehow, despite everything, she felt more hopeful than she had in years. Inside, she could hear Jonah's footsteps on the stairs, the quiet murmur of his voice as he settled the children for the night. Her family now. Not in the traditional sense, not with love or romance or any of the things she'd once dreamed about, but hers nonetheless. Evelyn Moore, the woman who'd been told her whole life that she was too much and not enough all at once, had found a place where she was needed. That would have to be enough. For now, it was more than enough. The first full day began before dawn, when darkness still pressed against the windows, and the summer stars were just beginning to fade. Evelyn woke to the sound of boots on the stairs. Jonah, already dressed, already moving toward another day of endless labor. She dressed quickly in the pre-dawn dimness, her fingers fumbling with buttons and laces, then made her way downstairs to find him building up the fire in the kitchen stove. Didn't mean to wake you, he said without turning around, feeding split wood into the firebox with practiced efficiency. You didn't. I'm a light sleeper. Evelyn moved to the basin, splashing cold water on her face to chase away the lingering fog of sleep. What needs doing first? Coffee, Jonah said simply. Everything else can wait until there's coffee. She found the grounds in a tin on the shelf, measured them into the battered pot, added water from the bucket by the door. The domestic routine felt strange and familiar all at once. She'd done these tasks 1,000 times before, but never in a kitchen that was supposedly hers, never for a man who was technically her husband. Emma will be down soon, Jonah continued, straightening up and dusting his hands on his trousers. She's always been an early riser. The others will sleep until they can't anymore, which gives us maybe an hour of peace. They worked in companionable silence as the sky outside slowly lightened from black to deep blue to pearl gray. The coffee began to boil, filling the kitchen with its rich, dark scent. Evelyn started breakfast, eggs, bacon from the cold room, leftover biscuits sliced and fried in the bacon grease the way her mother had taught her decades ago. Simple food, but filling, the kind that could sustain hard labor under an unforgiving sun. Emma appeared just as the eastern horizon was beginning to glow with the promise of sunrise, her hair already braided, her face scrubbed clean, looking like a miniature adult prepared to face another day of responsibilities that shouldn't belong to someone her age. Morning, she said quietly, moving automatically to set the table. Morning, sweetheart, Jonah replied, pouring coffee into chipped mugs. He glanced at Evelyn. You drink coffee? When I can get it, she admitted. It was expensive in Philadelphia, a luxury I couldn't usually afford. It's a necessity here, he said, pouring a third cup and sliding it across the table toward her. You'll understand why after your first full day. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, bitter and hot, and absolutely perfect. Evelyn wrapped her hands around the warm mug, savoring both the heat and the caffeine, watching father and daughter move around each other with the synchronized ease of long practice. Samuel's going to be difficult today, Emma said matter-of-factly, pulling butter from the cold box. He always is when things change. I noticed, Jonah replied dryly, but he'll work anyway. Being difficult doesn't excuse chores. What exactly are the morning chores? Evelyn asked, trying to understand the rhythm of this new life. Emma answered before her father could. Chickens need feeding and eggs collected, livestock need water and hay, garden needs checking, the heat's been hard on everything, so we have to water early before the sun gets too high. Thomas helps me with the chickens usually. Lucy's supposed to help with the garden, but she gets distracted. And Samuel? Evelyn prompted. Works with Pa, Jonah said, his tone suggesting this was both fact and ongoing battle. Or he's supposed to. Some days he remembers he's 9 and tries to do the work of a grown man. Other days he remembers he's 9 and resents every minute of it. The sun broke over the horizon as they ate, flooding the kitchen with golden light that promised another scorching day. One by one, the other children appeared, Lucy rubbing sleep from her eyes, Thomas dragging a cloth rabbit that had seen better days, Samuel last, his expression already set in defensive lines. Breakfast was quieter than dinner had been, everyone focused on food and the day ahead. But Evelyn noticed things in the silence. The way Jonah automatically cut Thomas's bacon into smaller pieces, how Emma poured milk for her siblings before taking any herself, how Lucy kept sneaking glances at Evelyn as if checking to make sure this new person was still really there. "Miss Moore." "Evelyn," Jonah corrected himself. "I'll need to show you around the property this morning, where everything is, what needs doing, how things work. Emma can watch the young ones for a few hours." "I can handle them, Pa," Emma said, a note of pride in her voice. "I know you can, sweetheart, but you shouldn't have to all the time anymore." Something passed between father and daughter then, a moment of understanding that made Emma's eyes grow bright before she blinked rapidly and focused intently on her plate. Change was hard, even when it was supposed to be for the better. After breakfast, Evelyn helped Emma clear the table while Jonah took Samuel outside to begin the day's work. Through the window, she could see them walking toward the barn, the boy's posture rigid with resentment, the man's patience visible in every careful step. "He used to worship Pa," Emma said quietly, following Evelyn's gaze. "Before Mama died. He'd follow him everywhere, wanted to do everything just like him. Now he's angry all the time, and I think Pa doesn't know how to fix it." "Some things can't be fixed," Evelyn replied gently. "Only survived until they hurt less." "Does it ever hurt less?" The question was small, vulnerable, completely unlike the capable facade Emma usually wore. Evelyn thought about her own mother's death, about the years of aching absence that had eventually softened into something bearable. "Yes," she said honestly, "but it takes longer than anyone wants it to." The property tour began once the kitchen was clean and the younger children were settled with simple tasks, Lucy helping Emma sort through outgrown clothes that might be mended and passed down, Thomas playing with carved wooden animals near the porch where they could watch him. Jonah led Evelyn across the sun-baked yard, pointing out the various buildings and explaining their purposes with the same straightforward efficiency he brought to everything else. "Barn's the most important structure besides the house," he said, opening the wide double doors to reveal a surprisingly well-organized interior. Hay bales stacked along one wall, tools hung on pegs, stalls for the horses, and a milk cow that regarded them with placid indifference. "We keep the livestock here overnight during winter, but summer they're mostly out to pasture." The barn smelled of hay and leather and animals, earthy and honest. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight streaming through gaps in the boards. Somewhere in the rafters, swallows had built nests, their chirping a constant background music. "This is where the fire started," Evelyn said. Not quite a question. Jonah's expression shuddered immediately. "How did you know about that?" "The Reverend mentioned it yesterday while we were waiting. Said there'd been trouble on your ranch a few months back, a fire in the barn." He was quiet for a long moment, running his hand along one of the support beams where new wood had been fitted to replace burned sections. The repairs were competent but obvious, the fresh lumber standing out pale against the weathered gray of the original structure. "It was arson," he said finally, his voice flat. "Someone said it deliberately, lost 3 horses, and nearly lost the whole building. Only reason we didn't was because Samuel smelled the smoke and raised the alarm in time." "Did they catch who did it?" "No, sheriff looked into it, but there wasn't much evidence. Could have been anyone with a grudge. And frontier justice being what it is, grudges aren't exactly rare." He moved toward the door, clearly done with the subject. "Point is, we watch for fire. Always. Summer like this, everything's dry as kindling. One spark could destroy everything." They continued the tour, the smokehouse where meat hung curing in the dim interior, the chicken coop where Lucy's morning collection efforts had clearly been enthusiastic, if not particularly thorough, the vegetable garden struggling valiantly against the heat despite Emma's careful tending. The well stood in the yard between the house and barn, a sturdy stone structure with a wooden bucket on a rope, the water level lower than Jonah would have liked. Creek's running slower than usual, he explained, gesturing toward the thin ribbon of water visible beyond the nearest pasture. We've had less rain than normal this summer. Not drought conditions yet, but heading that direction. Makes everything harder. Evelyn could see it in the landscape, the pale gold of stressed grass, the dust that rose with every footstep, the way even the trees along the creek seemed to droop slightly in the heat. This was a land that demanded respect, that gave nothing without extracting payment in sweat and worry and endless vigilance. "The cattle?" she asked, watching the distant shapes moving slowly across the hillside. "How many?" "Started with 50 head when I bought this place. Down to 38 now. Lost some to winter cold, some to predators, a few to illness." His jaw tightened. "Need to build the herd back up, but that takes money we don't have. Calves that survive to market age, which isn't guaranteed. Time, which is always in short supply." He showed her the boundaries of their property. Not all of it, that would take days of riding, but the immediate area around the house and outbuildings. Explained the rotation of the livestock, the ongoing battle against prairie dogs and groundhogs that undermine fences, the constant repairs needed to keep everything functional. Every word painted a picture of a man fighting to hold on to something that wanted to slip through his fingers like water, of a life balanced on the knife's edge between survival and failure. "It's a lot," Evelyn said finally, looking out across the golden grassland toward the purple mountains. "For one person." "It was manageable with two," Jonah replied, and the grief in his voice was almost casual now, worn smooth by 18 months of repetition. "Rachel and I worked this place together. She was as strong as any man I ever knew, and twice as stubborn. We had plans. Grow the herd, maybe add some sheep, build a bigger house for when the kids got older." He fell silent, and Evelyn didn't push. Some stories told themselves when they were ready. "Then she got sick," he continued after a moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Fever came on fast, burned through her in 3 days. Doctor from town finally made it out on the 4th day, took one look and said there was nothing to be done. She was already gone by then anyway." "I'm sorry," Evelyn said quietly, the words inadequate but genuine. "Everyone's sorry," Jonah said, not unkindly. "But sorry doesn't milk the cow or mend the fences or explain to a 3-year-old why his mama isn't coming back. Sorry's just a word people say when they don't know what else to offer." They walked back toward the house in silence, the sun climbing higher, the heat beginning to press down like a physical weight. Evelyn's dress stuck to her back with sweat, her feet ached in her too tight shoes, and she could already feel the beginning of a headache forming behind her eyes. But underneath the physical discomfort was something else, a growing understanding of what she'd stepped into, of the enormity of the task ahead. This wasn't just about cooking meals and washing clothes. This was about helping hold together a family and a ranch that were both threatening to come apart at the seams. This was about proving that she could carry weight, real weight, not just the pretense of usefulness, but actual, measurable contribution to survival. Samuel was mucking out stalls when they returned to the barn, his thin arms struggling with the pitchfork, sweat soaking through his shirt. He looked up at their approach, his expression defiant. "Doing it wrong," Jonah observed mildly. "Am not." "R2. You're lifting with your back instead of your legs, going to hurt yourself that way." "I'm fine," Samuel insisted, but Evelyn could see the strain in his small frame, the way he had to brace himself with each forkful. Jonah moved to his son's side, not taking the tool away but adjusting the boy's grip, showing him the proper stance. "Like this," he said patiently. "Let the tool do the work. You're just guiding it." For a moment, it seemed like Samuel might argue or throw down the pitchfork in frustration. But something in his father's calm instruction seemed to reach him, and he adjusted his stance, tried again. The next forkful came up easier, landing in the wheelbarrow with less effort. "Better," Jonah said simply, then moved on to check the water troughs, leaving Samuel to his task. Evelyn watched the boy work, seeing the fierce concentration on his young face, the determined set of his jaw. He was trying so hard to be grown up, to be useful, to fill a gap that wasn't his to fill, just like Emma, just like all of them, in their different ways. "Samuel," she said quietly, approaching but keeping a respectful distance, "your father mentioned you were the one who smelled the smoke when the barn caught fire." The boy's hand stilled on the pitchfork. "So?" So that was brave, quick thinking. Probably saved the whole ranch. Pa would have figured it out, Samuel muttered, but she could hear the faint note of pride underneath the dismissal. Maybe, Evelyn agreed, but maybe not in time. Sometimes the difference between disaster and survival is just one person noticing something wrong and raising the alarm. That was you. Samuel looked at her then, really looked, his dark eyes searching her face for mockery or manipulation. Finding neither, he shrugged and went back to work, but some of the rigid tension in his shoulders had eased. Small victories, Evelyn thought. That's how trust was built, not through grand gestures, but through small moments of genuine recognition, of seeing people for who they actually were rather than who you needed them to be. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of activity. Evelyn helped Emma with laundry, hauling water from the well until her arms ached, scrubbing clothes against the washboard until her knuckles were raw, hanging everything on lines strung between posts to dry in the relentless sun. The heat was astonishing, turning the yard into a shimmering oven, making even breathing feel like work. Lucy appeared periodically, her small face flushed pink, bringing updates on Thomas's activities with the seriousness of a military scout. He's digging by the creek now. He found a frog. He's trying to catch butterflies. Each report delivered solemnly, as if monitoring a 3-year-old was a task of vital importance. "Thank you, Lucy," Evelyn said after each update. "You're doing a wonderful job keeping track of him." The little girl would beam at the praise, then scamper off to resume her surveillance, thumb firmly in her mouth despite the heat. By noon, the sun was brutal, turning the landscape into a study in harsh light and deep shadow. Jonah came in from the fields with Samuel, both of them dirt-streaked and exhausted, and Evelyn had cold water and leftover biscuits with butter waiting. They ate standing up, too tired to bother with the formality of sitting down, drinking water like men crossing a desert. "Temperatures got to be over 90, Jonah said, splashing water from the basin on his face and neck. "Stock are suffering, going to have to move them closer to the creek this afternoon." "I can help," Samuel offered immediately. "I know you can, but it's too hot for you to be out there all afternoon. You and Emma take the young ones inside, stay in the shade. Me and Evelyn will handle the cattle." Evelyn looked up sharply. "I don't know anything about moving cattle." "You can learn," Jonah said simply. "Same way you learned everything else." An hour later, Evelyn found herself on horseback for the first time in her life, sitting astride a patient mare named Daisy, who seemed to understand that her rider had no idea what she was doing. Jonah had saddled both horses with quick efficiency, given Evelyn the most basic instructions on how to hold the reins and stay seated, then swung up onto his own mount, a rangy gelding called Duke, with the easy grace of someone who'd been riding since childhood. "Just let Daisy follow Duke," he instructed. "She knows what to do, even if you don't." They rode out across the pasture at a walk, the horses' hooves raising small clouds of dust with each step. The cattle were scattered across a wide area, some standing in what little shade the scattered trees provided, others simply lying in the grass, panting in the heat. As they approached, the animals began to move, not panicked, but wary, their large eyes watching the riders with cautious interest. "We're going to push them toward the creek," Jonah explained, his voice calm and clear. "Not fast, just steady pressure. Let them think it's their idea. If they spook, we'll have to start over, and nobody wants that in this heat." Evelyn watched him work, marveling at his quiet competence. He moved Duke into position with subtle shifts of weight and pressure, his body language communicating with the horse in ways words never could. When the cattle began to drift in the right direction, he made small adjustments, never pushing too hard, always allowing them to choose cooperation over resistance. "Your turn," he called over. "Come around to the left side, keep them moving." Daisy seemed to understand what was needed, even if Evelyn didn't. The mare moved into position almost on her own, responding to the lightest touch on the reins, and suddenly Evelyn found herself actually helping, actually contributing to moving 38 head of cattle toward better water and grazing. The work was hot, dusty, and exhausting. Sweat soaked through every layer of Evelyn's clothing. Her legs, unused to gripping a horse's sides, began to ache within minutes and were screaming by the end of the first hour. Flies buzzed in clouds around both riders and cattle, attracted by the smell of animals and sweat. The sun beat down with relentless intensity, turning the world into a blast furnace where every breath felt like inhaling fire. But underneath the discomfort was something else, a fierce satisfaction, a sense of accomplishment that came from doing real work that mattered. These cattle represented survival, represented the difference between making it through another winter and losing everything. And she was helping move them, was contributing something tangible and necessary. "You're doing good," Jonah said as they finally got the last stubborn steer moving toward the creek. "Natural seat on a horse. Didn't expect that." "Neither did I," Evelyn admitted, her voice rough with thirst and exertion. "I'm fairly certain every muscle I own is going to hate me tomorrow." "They will," he agreed cheerfully. "But you'll do it again anyway, because it needs doing. That's ranch life." By the time they returned to the house, the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon, the light turning golden and slightly less punishing. Emma had dinner started, another stew, this one with chicken and vegetables, and the younger children were playing a quiet game on the porch, their earlier energy depleted by the heat. Evelyn slid down from Daisy's back with profound relief, her legs trembling with fatigue. Jonah took the mare's reins with a slight smile. "Go on inside," he said. "I'll handle the horses. You earned a rest." "So did you," she pointed out. "I'm used to it. You're not. Go." She went, partly because her legs weren't sure they'd carry her much farther, partly because arguing seemed to require more energy than she possessed. Inside, Emma took one look at her dirt-streaked, sweat-soaked appearance and wordlessly poured a glass of water, pressing it into Evelyn's hands with the kind of understanding that came from experience. "First time on a horse is always rough," the girl said sympathetically. "Mama said she couldn't walk right for 3 days after Pa first took her riding." "Your mother sounds like she was very honest," Evelyn managed, drinking the water in desperate gulps. "She was," Emma agreed. "Papa says honesty's more important than comfort. Says lies might feel better in the moment, but truth serves you better in the long run." He's right about that. They worked together to finish dinner preparations, falling into an easy rhythm that felt almost comfortable. Emma showed Evelyn where things were stored, explained the quirks of the temperamental oven, shared small tips and tricks that made the work easier. For a child who'd been so defensive yesterday, she seemed willing to share knowledge now, as if Evelyn had passed some invisible test by actually staying, actually working, actually proving herself useful. Dinner was livelier than the previous night, the younger children chattering about their day with the uninhibited enthusiasm of those too young to guard their feelings. Thomas announced he'd seen 17 different bugs, each one described in exhaustive detail. Lucy reported that the chickens had laid eggs in new places, requiring a thorough search of the coop. Samuel, still prickly but fractionally less hostile, mentioned that he'd fixed the wobbly fence post by the garden. "Good work," Jonah said simply, and the boy's face showed a flash of pleasure before his defensive mask returned. Evelyn ate mechanically, too exhausted to fully taste the food, watching the family interact with growing understanding. They were all trying so hard to keep going, to be enough for each other, to survive the loss that had torn a hole through their lives. And they were managing it, barely, through sheer stubborn determination and Jonah's quiet leadership and Emma's premature competence. But just managing wasn't thriving. Just surviving wasn't the same as living. "Tomorrow," Jonah said as Emma and Evelyn began clearing the table, "we need to check the fences in the north pasture. They've been looking rough lately, and I don't want to lose stock to wandering." "I'll pack lunch," Evelyn offered. "We can eat while we work." He looked at her surprised. "You're planning to come?" "Unless you don't want the help," she said mildly. "But I figured an extra pair of hands wouldn't hurt." But something shifted in his expression. Not quite gratitude, not quite relief, but something in that territory. "No," he said quietly. "Extra hands definitely wouldn't hurt." That night, after the children were in bed and the house had settled into quiet, Evelyn sat on the front porch watching the stars emerge one by one from the darkening sky. Her whole body ached. Muscles she hadn't known existed announced their presence with enthusiastic complaints. Her hands were blistered from the rains, her face probably sunburned despite her bonnet, her feet swollen in her tight shoes. She'd never felt more exhausted in her life. She'd also never felt more needed. The door opened behind her, and Jonah emerged carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one without asking, then settled into the chair beside her with a tired sigh. "Long day," he observed. Very long, she agreed. Going to be a lot more just like it. I expect so. They sat in comfortable silence, drinking coffee and watching the night deepen. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called and another answered. The sound was wild and lonely and somehow perfect for this vast landscape. You did well today, Jonah said eventually. With the cattle, with Emma, with all of it. Thank you. I mean it. I wasn't sure. He trailed off, then started again. When I saw you in town, standing there while those men rejected you, I saw something familiar. Someone who'd been told they weren't good enough but was still standing anyway. Still trying. Evelyn looked at him in surprise. Is that why you spoke up? Partly, he admitted. Also because I needed help and you clearly needed a home, and that seemed like a fair trade. But mostly because I figured anyone who could stand up there with that much dignity while people were cruel, that person might have the strength for this life. I don't feel particularly dignified most of the time, Evelyn said honestly. Mostly I feel like I'm barely keeping up. That's how everyone feels, Jonah replied. The ones who pretend otherwise are just better liars. They finished their coffee as full darkness claimed the land, turning everything beyond the porch into shadows and starlight. Eventually, Jonah stood, stretching, his joints audibly protesting the day's labor. Better get some sleep, he said. Morning comes early. It does, Evelyn agreed, rising as well, her own body offering similar protests. He paused at the door, looking back at her. Evelyn? I'm glad you stayed. I know this isn't what you probably hoped for when you came west, but I'm glad anyway. Before she could respond, he was gone, his footsteps heavy on the stairs, leaving her alone with the night and the stars and a strange warmth in her chest that felt dangerously close to belonging. Evelyn Moore went to bed that night in her small room with its single window and narrow bed, her body aching, her hands raw, her future uncertain. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she fell asleep feeling like she mattered, like her presence made a difference, like the work she did had meaning beyond just survival. Tomorrow would bring more heat, more labor, more challenges to overcome. But tonight, she'd earned her place at this table, in this house, on this struggling ranch. And that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. The days that followed established a rhythm that was both punishing and strangely comforting in its predictability. Evelyn woke before dawn, her body gradually adjusting to the brutal schedule, even as new aches replaced old ones. She learned to read the sky for weather, to judge the animals' moods, to anticipate what needed doing before Jonah had to ask. The work was relentless. Fences that needed mending, livestock that required constant attention, a garden fighting a losing battle against the heat, meals to prepare for 6 hungry people 3 times a day. But she was getting stronger. Her soft seamstress hands developed calluses. Her legs stopped trembling after hours in the saddle. Her back learned to bend and lift without complaint. The children, watching this transformation with varying degrees of interest, began to treat her less like an intruder and more like a permanent fixture. Not quite family, not yet, but no longer a complete stranger either. It was the 3rd week of her residence when everything changed. The morning started like any other, with coffee in the pre-dawn darkness and breakfast by lamplight. But there was an unusual tension in Jonah's shoulders as he drank his coffee, his eyes fixed on something beyond the kitchen window that Evelyn couldn't see. What is it? She asked quietly, not wanting to alarm the children. Ryder coming, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Been watching him for the last 10 minutes. Coming from the south, deliberate-like. Not hurrying, but not wandering either. Evelyn moved to the window, following his gaze. Sure enough, a dark figure on horseback was approaching along the main track, still distant, but getting closer. Something about the rider's posture, the straight back, the controlled pace, suggested purpose rather than casual travel. Expecting anyone? She asked. No. Jonah set down his cup with more force than necessary. Emma, keep the young ones inside. Samuel, you too. Don't come out unless I call for you. But, Pa, Samuel started to protest. Do what I say, son. The steel in Jonah's voice left no room for argument. The children retreated to the back of the house, with Emma herding them like a seasoned sheepdog, though Evelyn could see faces pressed against the window glass, watching. Jonah moved toward the door, and Evelyn followed without thinking. You should stay inside too. he said, not looking at her. I'm your wife, she replied, using the word deliberately. Whatever this is, I'm standing with you. He glanced at her then, something shifting in his expression, surprise maybe, or reluctant respect. All right then. But let me do the talking. They stepped out onto the porch together as the rider drew close enough to make out details. He was well dressed for the frontier, tailored jacket despite the heat, polished boots, a hat that had never seen hard labor. His horse was expensive too, a sleek bay gelding with good lines and better grooming than most ranch animals ever received. Everything about him spoke of money, education, and the kind of casual authority that came from never having been told no. The rider pulled up in front of the house, his pale eyes sweeping across the property with the assessing gaze of someone calculating value. He was perhaps 40, with silver threading through dark hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and the kind of face that would be called distinguished in polite society. When his gaze landed on Evelyn, something flickered across his features: recognition, satisfaction, possession. Her stomach dropped. Evelyn, the man said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, it's been quite a search finding you. You've led me on quite a chase across half the territory. Mr. Blackwood, she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. I wasn't aware I needed to be found. Didn't you? Charles Blackwood swung down from his horse with easy grace, looping the reins over the porch rail as if he had every right to be there. Running off without a word, breaking our arrangement. That's hardly proper behavior. There was no arrangement, Evelyn said firmly, but she could hear the slight tremor underneath her words. Jonah stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Evelyn and their unwelcome visitor. I'm Jonah Hale. This is my ranch, and this is my wife. I think you've made a mistake, mister. Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. Your wife? How extraordinary. Tell me, Mr. Hale, when exactly did this marriage take place? 3 weeks ago, Jonah replied evenly. Properly witnessed by Reverend Michaels in Copper Ridge. All legal and binding. Is that so? Blackwood's attention returned to Evelyn, his expression calculating. How convenient. And how much did my dear Evelyn tell you about her situation before this hasty marriage? Enough, Jonah said, though Evelyn could hear the question underneath. Had she told him enough? Had she told him anything? She hadn't, because there'd been nothing to tell, or so she'd thought. She'd left Philadelphia believing she'd escaped Charles Blackwood's controlling interest, his persistent attempts to turn her employment with the Hartwell family into something far more binding. She'd believed distance and a new name. She'd been using her mother's maiden name instead of her father's when she applied to the mail order program would be enough. Apparently she'd been wrong. I see, Blackwood said pleasantly, his tone at odds with the steel in his eyes. Then perhaps I should explain the situation more fully. You see, Mr. Hale, Evelyn here was under contract to work for the Hartwell family in Philadelphia, a contract that she broke when she disappeared without notice, leaving them in quite a difficult position. Mrs. Hartwell has been beside herself with worry. That's not true, Evelyn interjected. My contract ended 6 months ago. I stayed on as a favor, but there was nothing binding me to remain. A matter of interpretation, Blackwood said smoothly. The Hartwells seem to recall things differently, as does Mr. Moore, your father, who's quite concerned about his daughter's whereabouts, and has retained my services to locate you and ensure your safe return. The lie was delivered with such conviction that for a moment Evelyn almost doubted her own memory. Her father hadn't spoken to her in 5 years, not since she'd refused his demands to hand over her wages to support his drinking. He certainly hadn't retained an expensive lawyer to find her. My father and I aren't in contact, she said clearly, and I fulfilled every obligation to the Hartwell family. I owe them nothing, and I certainly owe you nothing, Mr. Blackwood. The courts might see it differently. Blackwood's pleasant mask was beginning to slip, revealing the calculation underneath. Breach of contract is a serious matter, as is theft of property. Several items went missing from the Hartwell household around the time of your departure. You're calling my wife a thief? Jonah's voice had gone dangerously quiet. I'm simply stating facts as they've been reported to me, Blackwood replied. Now, we could resolve this unpleasantly, with sheriffs and courts and public scandal. or Evelyn could simply return with me to Philadelphia where we can sort everything out in a civilized manner. I'm not going anywhere with you, Evelyn said, her hands clenched in her skirt to hide their trembling. I told you in Philadelphia, and I'll tell you again here. I'm not interested in your proposals, business or otherwise. Something ugly crossed Blackwood's face. You think you have a choice? You think some frontier marriage to a dirt farmer changes anything? I have resources you can't imagine, connections that reach farther than this provincial territory. If I say you're a thief and a contract breaker, that's what everyone will believe. Except it's not true, Jonah said, his voice cutting through Blackwood's threats like a blade. And I don't care how many resources you have or how many connections you think you've got. Evelyn is my wife, and she's under my protection. That means something out here, even if it doesn't back in Philadelphia. Your protection? Blackwood laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. Look around you, Hale. Your ranch is barely holding together. Your barn shows evidence of recent fire damage. You're running, what, maybe 40 head of cattle when you should have 3 times that? You're one bad season away from losing everything. You really think you can protect anyone when you can't even protect yourself? The accuracy of the assessment hit like a physical blow. Evelyn saw Jonah's jaw tighten, saw the flash of anger in his eyes before he controlled it. Maybe so, Jonah replied quietly. But I've survived worse than you, and I'm still standing. That ought to tell you something. Blackwood studied them both for a long moment, his expression calculating. When he spoke again, his voice had regained its veneer of civility, though the threat underneath was unmistakable. I'm staying at the hotel in Copper Ridge, he said. I'll give you 3 days to reconsider this foolish position, Evelyn. 3 days to remember that your actions have consequences, not just for you, but for anyone who chooses to harbor you. After that, I'll pursue legal remedies. And I assure you, the courts look dimly on women who break contracts and marriages entered under false pretenses. He swung back onto his horse with the same easy grace, gathering the reins. Oh, and Mr. Hale? You might want to ask your wife about her real name, about why she felt the need to change it when she came west. Secrets have a way of destroying trust, don't they? Especially in a marriage as convenient as yours appears to be. With that parting shot, he turned his horse and rode away at a leisurely pace, a man supremely confident in his power and position. Evelyn and Jonah stood on the porch, watching until he was out of sight. Only then did Jonah turn to her, his expression unreadable. Is any of that true? He asked quietly. About contracts or theft or using a false name? No. Evelyn met his eyes directly, willing him to believe her. The contract ended. I took nothing that wasn't mine, and I used my mother's maiden name, Moore, instead of Sullivan, because I wanted a fresh start without my father's reputation following me. That's all. I never stole anything, never broke any contract. I refused Charles Blackwood's marriage proposal, and he didn't take it well. He proposed marriage? Several times. He's a lawyer who handles business for the Hartwell family. Wealthy, well-connected, and completely unwilling to accept that I didn't want to marry him. He sees me as property he has a right to acquire. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling cold despite the morning heat. I thought leaving Philadelphia would be enough. I thought he'd move on to someone else. Men like that don't move on, Jonah said grimly. They just get more determined. Inside the house, she could hear the children's voices. Emma trying to keep them calm, Samuel demanding to know what was happening, little Lucy crying softly. The sound grounded her, reminded her what was at stake. I'll leave, she said suddenly. Tonight. I'll pack and go before he can follow through on his threats. I won't let my problems destroy what you've built here. No. The word was flat, final. Jonah, no, he repeated, turning to face her fully. You made a promise to stay. I made a promise to protect you. Running away breaks both of those, and I don't break my word. But he's right about the ranch barely holding together, Evelyn argued. You can't afford a legal battle. You can't afford the attention. If he brings the sheriff out here, starts making accusations, then we deal with it. Jonah's voice was calm, but she could see the steel underneath. Together. That's what married people do, isn't it? Face problems together? This isn't a real marriage, Evelyn whispered. Not really. It's an arrangement, a practical solution. You don't owe me. It's real enough, Jonah interrupted. Real enough that you've been working yourself half to death for 3 weeks keeping this place running. Real enough that my children are starting to smile again. Real enough that I just told that fancy lawyer from Philadelphia to go to hell because nobody threatens my wife." The possession in those last 2 words sent warmth flooding through her chest. His wife. Not in the romantic sense she'd once dreamed about, but in the way that mattered out here. Partnership, loyalty, mutual protection against a harsh world. "What do we do?" she asked quietly. "First, we tell the truth to anyone who asks. Second, we make sure your marriage certificate is properly filed. I'll ride into town this afternoon, make sure it's official in every way possible. Third, we prepare for whatever Blackwood tries next." He paused, his expression grim. "And fourth, we watch for trouble. Men like him don't make threats they're not prepared to carry out." The rest of that day passed in tense preparation. Jonah rode into Copper Ridge with Samuel, ostensibly to file papers, but also, Evelyn suspected, to gauge the town's mood and warn the sheriff about potential trouble. Emma, sensing the seriousness of the situation, kept the younger children occupied with tasks and games, her young face showing the strain of once again carrying adult worries. Evelyn threw herself into work, needing the physical exhaustion to quiet her churning thoughts. She weeded the garden with fierce determination, hauled water until her arms ached, scrubbed the kitchen floor on her hands and knees. Anything to avoid thinking about Charles Blackwood's pale eyes, his smooth threats, the casual way he'd dismissed her marriage as if it meant nothing. Lucy found her in the garden in the late afternoon, thumb in mouth, her small face worried. "Is that bad man going to take you away?" she asked around her thumb. Evelyn set down her trowel and pulled the little girl into her lap, not caring about the dirt on her dress. "No, sweetheart. I'm staying right here." "Promise?" "I promise." "Mama promised too," Lucy said softly, and the simple statement carried the weight of a child's shattered trust. She promised she'd get better, but she didn't. Evelyn felt her heart crack. How did you explain to a 6-year-old that some promises were beyond human power to keep? That death wasn't a choice, but leaving was? "Your mama didn't want to break that promise," she said gently. "Sometimes our bodies get sick in ways we can't control. But leaving here, leaving you and Emma and your brothers and your papa, that would be my choice. And I'm choosing to stay. Do you understand the difference?" Lucy nodded slowly, though Evelyn wasn't sure she really did. The little girl leaned against her chest, one hand clutching Evelyn's sleeve as if physical contact could make the promise more binding. They sat like that until Emma called them in for supper, watching the sun sink toward the mountains, casting long shadows across the golden grassland. In the distance, Evelyn could see Jonah and Samuel returning, their silhouettes dark against the brilliant sky. Supper was quieter than usual, the adults' tension seeping into the children despite everyone's efforts to maintain normalcy. Jonah reported that the marriage certificate had been properly filed, that the sheriff had been informed of a potential troublemaker staying in town, that Reverend Michaels had confirmed the validity of the ceremony in case anyone questioned it. "Sheriff doesn't have much love for fancy city lawyers," Jonah added, his tone dry. "Said if Blackwood causes problems, he'll handle it according to territorial law, which tends to favor actual residents over visiting troublemakers." It was small comfort, but comfort nonetheless. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, listening to the house settle, her mind running through scenarios and possibilities. Blackwood had money, connections, and the kind of ruthless determination that didn't quit just because one avenue was blocked. What would he try next? Legal action? Bribery? More direct threats? Around midnight, she heard footsteps in the hallway, then a soft knock on her door. "Evelyn?" Jonah's voice quiet so as not to wake the children. "You awake?" "Yes." She rose, wrapping a shawl around her nightgown, and opened the door. He stood in the dim hallway, still fully dressed, a rifle cradled in the crook of his arm. His expression was alert, watchful. "Can't sleep either?" she asked. "Thought I'd keep watch," he said. "Just in case. Blackwood didn't strike me as the patient type." "You think he'd try something tonight?" "Don't know, but I'd rather be prepared and wrong than unprepared and sorry." He hesitated, then added, "You could try to rest. I'll keep watch." "I couldn't sleep anyway," Evelyn admitted. "I keep thinking about what he said, about secrets destroying trust." Jonah was quiet for a moment. Do you have any other secrets I should know about? No. My father's name is Sullivan, not Moore. He's a drunk who demanded I support his habit with my wages. I refused, and he disowned me. That's why I used my mother's name when I applied to come west. I didn't want anyone tracking me down based on family connections. She paused. Is that going to be a problem? No, Jonah said simply. Plenty of people out here are running from family, from pasts, from things they'd rather forget. Hell, I came to Montana partly to get away from my own father's expectations. That doesn't make you a liar, just makes you human. The acceptance in his voice eased something tight in her chest. Thank you. For what? For believing me. For not just sending me away to avoid trouble. Evelyn, I've got 4 kids, a struggling ranch, and a dead wife's memory that I carry around like extra weight. I'm about the last person who has any right to judge someone else for being complicated. He shifted the rifle slightly. Besides, you've earned your place here. That matters more than whatever fancy lawyer says about contracts and theft. They stood in the hallway, the house quiet around them, and Evelyn felt the strange intimacy of the moment. 2 people brought together by practical necessity, slowly discovering that practical could become personal in ways neither had expected. I should let you try to rest, Jonah said finally. But leave your door open. If anything happens, I want to be able to hear. She nodded, watching as he moved to position himself at the top of the stairs where he could see both the front door and the hallway. He settled against the wall, rifle across his knees, prepared to wait out the night. Evelyn returned to her room but left the door ajar as instructed. She lay back down, pulling the quilt up despite the warmth, and listened to the night sounds. Crickets, the distant howl of coyotes, the creak of old wood settling, and underneath it all, the quiet presence of a man keeping watch, standing guard against threats both known and unknown. She must have dozed eventually because she woke to the smell of smoke. For a moment, still caught in the fog of sleep, she thought it was just the kitchen stove being lit for breakfast. Then she heard Jonah's shout, "Fire!" and Emma's scream, and suddenly she was wide awake and running. The barn was burning. Flames had already engulfed the back section, licking up the weathered boards with terrifying speed, casting orange light across the yard that turned night into a hellish parody of day. Smoke billowed in thick clouds, and somewhere inside horses were screaming in panic. Jonah was already running toward the barn, Samuel close behind him despite his small size. Evelyn flew down the stairs, her nightgown tangling around her legs. No time for shoes or propriety or anything except the immediate crisis. "Emma!" she shouted. "Get buckets! Water from the well! Lucy, Thomas, stay on the porch! Don't move!" The heat hit her like a physical force as she neared the barn. Jonah had already thrown open the main doors, smoke pouring out in choking waves. The horses inside were in a frenzy, their shrill cries of terror cutting through the roar of flames. "The horses!" Jonah yelled, his voice rough with smoke. "Get them out!" Evelyn didn't think, didn't hesitate, didn't consider that she'd never handled frightened horses before. She just ran into the smoke-filled barn, her eyes streaming, her lungs burning, following the sound of panicked whinnying. Daisy was in the nearest stall, rearing and kicking, whites of her eyes showing in the firelight. Evelyn grabbed a halter from the wall, moved to the stall door. The mare's hooves came down inches from her head, but she ducked and slipped inside anyway, murmuring words she didn't even register, just sound and tone meant to calm. "Easy, girl, easy. We're getting out. Come on now, come with me." Somehow, she'd never know how, she got the halter on Daisy's tossing head. Somehow she led the panicked mare out of the stall, through the smoke, toward the open doors and fresh air beyond. The horse bolted the moment she cleared the barn, galloping into the night, but she was alive and free. Evelyn turned back toward the inferno. Jonah emerged with Duke, the gelding wild-eyed but following his master's firm hand. Samuel came behind, leading the milk cow who moved with surprising calm given the chaos. But there were still 2 horses inside, and the fire was spreading fast, consuming the hay storage, moving toward the main structure. "Stay out," Jonah commanded, seeing Evelyn turn back. "It's too dangerous." She ignored him, plunging back into the smoke. The remaining horses, a young mare named Belle and an older gelding called Rusty, were in the back stalls, the section closest to the flames. The heat was unbearable now, the smoke so thick she could barely see. Her lungs screamed for clean air, her eyes streamed tears, but she kept moving, kept searching. Belle's stall. The young mare was thrashing, beyond reason, beyond calming. Evelyn fumbled with the latch, got the door open, barely avoided being trampled as the horse burst free and ran for the exit. One more. Just one more. She couldn't see. The smoke was too thick, the heat pressing in from all sides. She dropped to her hands and knees where the air was slightly clearer, crawled forward, calling for Rusty. A hand grabbed her arm, yanking her backward. Jonah, his face streaked with soot, fury, and fear, warring in his expression. "Out!" he shouted. "Now! One more horse! Out, or we both die!" He was dragging her not gently toward the doors. She fought him, still trying to reach the last stall, but his grip was iron. Then Samuel was there too, tugging at her other arm, both of them pulling her away from the flames. They burst into the night air just as part of the barn's roof collapsed inward with a shower of sparks and a roar like some great beast dying. Evelyn fell to her knees, coughing violently, her throat raw, her lungs burning. Jonah collapsed beside her, equally wrecked. "Rusty," she gasped between coughs. "Still inside!" As if in answer, a dark shape burst through the smoke and flame. The old gelding, making his own escape, mane and tail singed but alive. He galloped past them toward the others, driven by instinct and survival. Emma and Lucy appeared with buckets, water sloshing, but it was immediately clear it was too late to save the barn. The best they could do was wet down the other buildings to prevent the fire from spreading, create a firebreak to protect the house. They worked through the night like demons, hauling water, dousing sparks, watching as the barn burned to its foundation. The children helped despite their fear, even small Thomas carrying cups of water with fierce determination. By the time dawn broke, they were all smoke-stained, exhausted, and facing the smoldering ruins of what had been the ranch's second most important structure. Jonah stood looking at the wreckage, his face unreadable. His hands were burned in places, his clothes scorched, his voice gone hoarse from smoke and shouting. But everyone was alive. The horses were safe. The house still stood. It could have been so much worse. "Pa," Samuel said quietly, his young voice shaking. "I found this." He held out an object, a glass bottle, partially melted by the heat, but still recognizable as a whiskey bottle. And tied around its neck was a strip of cloth that had been used as a wick. Deliberate, intentional. Arson. Evelyn's blood ran cold. Charles Blackwood had said he'd give them 3 days to reconsider. He'd said consequences would follow. But to burn down their barn, to risk lives, to destroy property, all because she'd refused him? "It was him," she said, her voice rough from smoke and fury. "Blackwood. It had to be." "Maybe," Jonah said grimly, taking the bottle from Samuel, "but proving it is another matter." He looked at her, his dark eyes hard as flint. "This is past words and warnings. This is attempted murder, far as I'm concerned." "I'll leave," Evelyn said again. "Right now, before he can do anything else." "No." Jonah's voice cracked like a whip. "No more talk of leaving. This is our home, our land, and nobody, not fancy lawyers or arsonists or anyone else, is going to drive us off it." He turned to face his family, all of them gathered there in the dawn light, smoke-stained and exhausted, but standing. "Everyone inside, we'll clean up, rest, then we're riding to town. Sheriff needs to see this evidence. And Blackwood needs to understand that whatever game he thinks he's playing, he just made it very personal." As they trooped toward the house, Evelyn felt Emma's hand slip into hers, small fingers gripping tight. "You saved the horses," the girl said quietly. "You could have died, but you went back anyway." "They needed saving," Evelyn replied simply. "So did we," Emma whispered. "And you stayed." Standing there in the scorched yard, watching the sun rise over the devastation, Evelyn understood something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't just the mail-order bride anymore, the convenient solution to a practical problem. She was part of this family, woven into their lives through shared danger and mutual protection. Charles Blackwood had tried to destroy what she'd found here. Instead, he'd only made it stronger. They cleaned up as best they could, scrubbing soot from faces and hands, changing into fresh clothes that immediately felt too clean against smoke-damaged skin. Evelyn's hands shook as she buttoned her dress, the aftermath of terror and exhaustion catching up now that the immediate crisis had passed. Through her small window, she could see the barn's blackened skeleton against the morning sky, smoke still rising in thin gray ribbons from the ruins. Jonah was waiting downstairs, his jaw set in a way that suggested barely controlled fury. He'd changed into clean clothes too, but there was no hiding the burns on his hands or the raw determination in his eyes. Samuel stood beside him, holding the melted whiskey bottle wrapped carefully in cloth, looking older than his 9 years. "Emma," Jonah said quietly, "you're in charge while we're gone. Keep the young ones close to the house. Don't answer the door for anyone except us or the sheriff. Understand?" "Yes, Pa." Emma's voice was steady, but Evelyn could see the fear underneath. The girl had already lost one parent. The fire had reminded her how easily she could lose everything else. Evelyn moved to Emma's side, placing both hands on the girl's thin shoulders. "We'll be back before supper," she promised. "And when we return, we're going to figure out how to move forward from this. Together." "What if he comes back?" Emma whispered, her carefully maintained composure cracking just slightly. "What if he tries to hurt you again?" "Then he'll have to go through your father first," Evelyn said firmly, "and me, and half the town if the sheriff does his job right." The ride into Copper Ridge took over an hour, the wagon wheels raising dust from the dry road, the morning sun climbing steadily toward its brutal zenith. Samuel sat between Jonah and Evelyn on the bench, the cloth-wrapped bottle cradled in his lap like dangerous cargo. Nobody spoke much. There wasn't much to say that hadn't already been communicated in the grim set of Jonah's jaw, the protective way Evelyn kept glancing at Samuel, the boy's white-knuckled grip on the evidence. The town was just beginning to stir when they arrived, shopkeepers opening shutters, a few early customers already moving about their business. Jonah drove straight to the sheriff's office, a squat wooden building near the center of town with bars on the windows and a single hitching post out front. Sheriff Tom Brennan was a weathered man in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and the kind of steady gaze that came from seeing too much human foolishness to be surprised by much anymore. He looked up from his coffee as they entered, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to sharp attention when he saw their soot-stained faces and Samuel's careful burden. "Jonah," he said, setting down his cup. "What happened?" "Someone burned down my barn last night," Jonah replied flatly, "while my family was sleeping. Could have spread to the house. Could have killed us all." Brennan was on his feet immediately. "Anyone hurt?" "No, we got the livestock out. Lost the building and everything stored in it, but everyone's alive." Jonah gestured to Samuel. "Show him." The boy carefully unwrapped the bottle, placing it on the sheriff's desk with hands that barely trembled. The melted glass caught the light streaming through the window, the charred cloth still tied around its neck, unmistakable in its purpose. "Found this in what's left of the barn," Samuel said, his young voice steady. "It's a firebomb. Someone threw it deliberately." Brennan leaned in, studying the evidence without touching it. His expression darkened. "You got any idea who might want to do this?" "Charles Blackwood," Evelyn said before Jonah could answer. "He's a lawyer from Philadelphia. He came to the ranch yesterday morning, made threats about legal action and consequences. Said he'd give us 3 days to reconsider our position. Last night, our barn burned." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "This the same fancy fellow who checked into the hotel 2 days ago? Dark hair, expensive clothes, acts like he owns the place?" "That's him," Jonah confirmed. "And what's his grievance with you folks?" Evelyn took a breath, then laid out the whole story. Her work for the Hartwell family, Blackwood's unwanted proposals, her decision to leave Philadelphia and start fresh, the mail-order bride program, her marriage to Jonah. She left nothing out, including Blackwood's accusations about broken contracts and theft, his obvious anger at her rejection. Brennan listened without interrupting, his weathered face growing progressively grimmer. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming a slow pattern on his desk. "These accusations about theft and contracts," he said finally. "Any truth to them?" "None," Evelyn said firmly. "I fulfilled my obligations to the Hartwell family. I took nothing that wasn't mine. He's manufacturing reasons to force me back to Philadelphia. And this marriage? Brennan looked between her and Jonah. It's legitimate? Performed by Reverend Michaels 3 weeks ago, Jonah replied. Properly witnessed, properly filed. I rode into town yesterday to make sure all the paperwork was in order, in case anyone questioned it. Because Blackwood was already making noise about it being false. Because he's the kind of man who looks for weaknesses and exploits them, Jonah said bluntly. And I wasn't about to give him ammunition. Brennan nodded slowly, picking up the bottle carefully and examining it from different angles. Problem is, having motive and having proof are two different things. Unless someone saw him near your property last night, unless we can tie him directly to this bottle, it's his word against yours. His word? Samuel burst out, his control finally breaking. Someone tried to burn down our home. They could have killed my little brother and sisters. And you're saying we need more proof? I'm saying I need evidence that'll hold up, son, Brennan replied, not unkindly. I believe you. I believe something bad happened, and this Blackwood character is likely behind it. But believing and proving are different things, especially when you're dealing with someone who's got money and legal training. So what do we do? Evelyn asked, trying to keep the despair from her voice. Just wait for him to try again? No, Brennan said firmly. We handle this the right way. I'm going to go have a conversation with Mr. Blackwood. Friendly-like, you understand, just checking on how he's enjoying his stay in our town. See what he was doing last night, where he was. Who might have seen him? Sometimes people with guilty consciences say things they shouldn't when they're feeling confident. And if he was careful, Jonah pressed, if he hired someone to do his dirty work, then we watch him. And we watch whoever he associates with. And we make it very clear that this town protects its own, and you folks are our own now. Lawyers' claims be damned. Brennan stood, buckling on his gun belt with deliberate movements. You did right bringing this to me. Now let me do my job. They left the sheriff's office with slightly more hope than they'd entered with, though Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were fighting a battle on ground that favored their opponent. Blackwood had money, connections, and the veneer of legal authority. They had nothing but the truth and a town sheriff's promise to investigate. I need to see Reverend Michaels, Jonah said as they emerged into the bright sunlight. Make sure he's prepared to testify about the marriage if it comes to that. Samuel, you stay with Evelyn. I'll be back shortly. He strode off toward the small church at the edge of town, leaving Evelyn and Samuel standing beside the wagon. The boy looked up at her, his young face troubled. Do you think he'll keep coming after us? Samuel asked quietly. Even if the sheriff talks to him? I don't know, Evelyn admitted. She wouldn't lie to him, wouldn't offer false comfort. Men like Blackwood don't give up easily, but neither do people like your father, or like you. I'm not brave, Samuel said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm scared all the time. Scared something bad will happen again. Scared of losing more people. Evelyn crouched down, bringing herself to his eye level despite the dust and the curious looks from passing townspeople. Being scared doesn't mean you're not brave, Samuel. Brave means doing what needs doing even when you're terrified. You ran into that barn last night. You helped save the animals. You've been taking care of your family since your mother died. That's brave. You ran into the barn too, he pointed out, even though you could have died. Because your family is my family now, Evelyn said simply, and family protects each other. Something shifted in Samuel's expression, the defensive walls he'd maintained since she arrived beginning to crack. You really mean that? About us being your family? I really mean it. He studied her face for a long moment, searching for deception and finding none. Then, so quickly she almost missed it, he stepped forward and wrapped his thin arms around her waist in a fierce hug. Evelyn's breath caught, her arms coming up automatically to hold him, this angry, scared, brave little boy who'd been trying so hard to be grown up. I'm glad you stayed, he mumbled against her dress. Even if it's dangerous, even if that man is trying to hurt us, I'm glad you're here. Me too, Evelyn whispered, her throat tight. Me too, sweetheart. They pulled apart as Jonah emerged from the church, Reverend Michaels walking beside him, the older man's face set in determined lines. The Reverend nodded at Evelyn, then climbed up into his own wagon and headed toward the sheriff's office, clearly ready to provide whatever testimony was needed. Michael's going to speak to Brennan, Jonah reported, climbing up onto the wagon bench. Make sure there's no question about the marriage being legitimate. He's also going to spread word among the church community about what happened. Sometimes social pressure works better than legal pressure in small towns. They headed back toward the ranch, the morning sun now high and merciless, turning the landscape into a shimmering study in heat and endurance. About halfway home, they spotted a rider approaching from the opposite direction, a young man on a sturdy pinto, waving as he drew closer. "That's Danny Morrison," Jonah said, slowing the wagon. "Works at the hotel. Wonder what he's doing out here." Danny pulled up alongside them, his young face flushed from the heat and exertion. "Mr. Hale, I was heading to your place. Got some information I thought you should know." "What kind of information?" Jonah asked carefully. "About that Blackwood fellow, the one staying at the hotel." Danny glanced at Evelyn, then back to Jonah. "He left the hotel around midnight last night, came back about 2 hours later, smelling like smoke and looking mighty satisfied with himself. I was working the night desk, saw the whole thing." Evelyn's heart began to pound. "Did he say where he'd been?" "Said he couldn't sleep, went for a ride to clear his head. But Mr. Hale, his hands were dirty, and there were scorch marks on his jacket sleeve. I noticed because it seemed strange for someone so particular about his appearance." Danny shifted in his saddle. "Then, this morning, I heard about your barn burning. Seemed like too much of a coincidence." "You tell Sheriff Brennan this?" Jonah demanded. "Just came from there. He's heading to the hotel now to question Blackwood officially." Danny's expression turned apologetic. "But I wanted to warn you, Blackwood was talking to some rough-looking characters this morning. Hired men looked like. 3 of them, all armed. Said something about finishing what he started." The word sent ice through Evelyn's veins despite the summer heat. "He's hiring men? For what?" "Don't know, ma'am. But it didn't sound friendly. One of them mentioned something about people learning to respect their betters, and they all laughed like it was some kind of joke." Jonah's hands tightened on the reins. "Samuel, hold on. We're going faster." He snapped the reins, urging the horses into a trot despite the heat. The wagon bounced over the rutted road, Evelyn gripping the bench to keep her seat, her mind racing with terrible possibilities. Emma and the younger children were alone at the ranch. If Blackwood had hired men, if he was planning something more direct than arson— "How far back are we?" she asked, trying to calculate distances and time. 20 minutes if we push," Jonah replied, his jaw set. "Danny, right ahead, fast as you can. Get to my ranch and make sure my children are safe. Anyone tries to approach the house, you fire a warning shot and barricade the door. Understand?" "Yes, sir." Danny wheeled his horse and took off at a gallop, dust rising in his wake. The next 20 minutes felt like hours. Evelyn kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, watching for any sign of smoke, any indication of new disaster. Beside her, Samuel sat rigid with tension, his small hands clenched into fists. Jonah drove the horses as hard as he dared, the wagon wheels eating up the distance while the sun beat down mercilessly. When the ranch finally came into view, Evelyn's breath caught. Everything looked normal, the house standing peacefully in the summer heat, no signs of violence or disturbance. Danny's horse was tied at the porch rail, the young man standing guard by the door, his rifle ready but not raised. Jonah pulled the wagon to a stop, was down and moving before the wheels had fully stopped turning. "Danny, report!" "All quiet, sir. Children are inside, all accounted for. Nobody's approached since I got here 10 minutes ago." Jonah's shoulders sagged fractionally with relief, then immediately tensed again. "But they could still be coming." "Yes, sir. That's why I think we should prepare. Get the children somewhere safe. Set up a proper defense." Emma appeared in the doorway, Lucy and Thomas clinging to her skirts, her face pale but composed. "Pa? What's happening?" "Get inside," Jonah ordered, but gently. "All of you. Evelyn, help me secure the shutters. Danny, you know how to shoot that rifle?" "My pa taught me, sir." "Good. Keep watch from the upstairs window. Best vantage point." Jonah was already moving, checking windows, securing doors, transforming their home into a fortress with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Evelyn herded the children inside, her mind struggling to process how quickly everything had escalated. Yesterday, they'd been a struggling ranch family dealing with heat and hard work. Today, they were preparing for an armed assault, barricading themselves in their own home against a man whose pride couldn't accept rejection. I don't understand, Lucy whimpered, her thumb firmly in her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. Why is everyone so scared? Because sometimes bad people do bad things, Emma said, her voice remarkably steady for an 11-year-old facing potential violence. But we're going to be okay. Pa won't let anything happen to us. But Evelyn could see the terror underneath Emma's brave words, could see it reflected in Samuel's tense shoulders, in the way Thomas clung to his sister's dress. These children had already survived one devastating loss. They shouldn't have to face this too. She moved to where Jonah was checking his rifle, making sure it was loaded and ready. This is my fault, she said quietly. All of it. If I just went back with him— Don't, Jonah cut her off sharply. Don't you dare finish that sentence. You're not responsible for his actions. He is. And if he wants a fight, he'll get one. But it won't be because we gave in to threats and bullying. But the children will learn that sometimes you have to stand your ground, that some things are worth fighting for. He met her eyes, his expression fierce. You're worth fighting for, Evelyn. This family is worth fighting for. Our home is worth fighting for. That's the lesson they need to learn. Before she could respond, Danny called down from upstairs. Riders coming! 3 of them, approaching from the south. Jonah was at the window instantly, peering through a gap in the shutters. Armed? Yes, sir. All carrying rifles. Position yourself at the front window. Don't shoot unless I give the word or they fire first. Jonah turned to Evelyn. Get the children into the cellar, now. I'm staying with you, she said firmly. Evelyn, they're coming because of me. I'm staying. Something passed between them. Argument, acceptance, and a fierce determination that matched his own. Jonah nodded once, then turned to Emma. Take your brothers and sister to the cellar. Don't come up until we call you. If anything happens to me or Evelyn, you wait until dark, then take the back trail to town. Find Sheriff Brennan. Tell him everything. Understand? Yes, Pa. Emma's voice barely shook as she gathered the younger children, shepherding them toward the cellar door with the competence of someone far older than her years. Wait, Evelyn said suddenly. She pulled Emma into a fierce hug, then crouched to embrace Lucy and Thomas. You're brave, wonderful children, all of you. No matter what happens, remember that. You're coming back up, right? Lucy asked, her small voice trembling. That's the plan, Evelyn said, managing a smile. But just in case, I want you to know how much you all mean to me. Samuel was the last. He looked at her, his young face set in grim lines, then surprised her by stepping forward and hugging her tightly. Don't die, he whispered fiercely. You promised you'd stay. I'm not planning on going anywhere, she promised. The children disappeared into the cellar, Emma pulling the heavy door shut behind them. The house suddenly felt both too large and too small, the silence broken only by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Jonah positioned himself at the main window, rifle ready. Evelyn took a position at the side window, no weapon but determined to see what was coming. Danny remained upstairs, covering the approach from the higher vantage point. The 3 riders came to a stop about 50 yards from the house, spreading out in a loose line. They were exactly what Danny had described, hired thugs, the kind of men who do anything for money and ask no questions about morality or justice. The man in the center was older, maybe 40, with a scar running down one cheek and the cold eyes of someone who'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. Jonah Hale, the scarred man called out. We got business to discuss. Jonah opened the door just enough to be heard, staying behind cover. Say what you've got to say. Mr. Blackwood wants his property returned. You hand over the woman, we ride away peaceful. Nobody gets hurt. She's not property, Jonah called back. She's my wife, and she's not going anywhere. That's so. The man's laugh was ugly. Well, Mr. Blackwood figured you might be difficult. So he asked us to make it real simple for you. Hand her over in the next 5 minutes, or we burn what's left of your buildings. Maybe put a few bullets through your walls while we're at it. Your choice. Evelyn felt rage replace her fear. These men, this situation, all of it because Charles Blackwood couldn't accept that she'd said no. Couldn't accept that she belonged to herself, not to him. She moved before Jonah could stop her, pulling open the door and stepping out onto the porch. I'm right here, she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. And I'm telling you the same thing I told Charles Blackwood in Philadelphia. I'm not his property. I'm not going anywhere with him, and if you're smart, you'll ride away now before the sheriff arrives." The scarred man grinned, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Sheriff's busy in town, lady, and you don't get a vote in this. Mr. Blackwood's paying good money, and we aim to deliver what he bought." "Get back inside," Jonah hissed, but Evelyn stood her ground. "I'm a married woman under the protection of my husband and territorial law," she continued, her voice steady despite the trembling in her legs. "If you touch me, if you threaten my family, you're breaking the law, and these frontier towns have a habit of handling lawbreakers harshly." "That a fact?" The man nudged his horse forward a few steps. "Way I see it, you're just one woman and a broke rancher against 3 armed men. Math doesn't work in your favor." "Math works fine," a new voice called out, and Evelyn's heart leaped. Sheriff Brennan rode into view from the north, his rifle across his saddle, his badge catching the sunlight. Behind him came Reverend Michaels, and behind him, incredibly, came more riders, townspeople, ranchers from neighboring properties, men and women who'd heard about the trouble and come to help. "Sheriff," the scarred man said, his confidence faltering slightly, "this is private business." "Nothing's private when it involves arson and threats against my citizens," Brennan replied, his voice hard as iron. "And I got about 20 witnesses